Nicholas of Cusa, as probably most of you know, he was a priest and scholar in the 15th century, and he really was interested, I think, in tackling the very current issues of his time by synthesizing diverse schools of thought. So he was educated in the scholastic tradition, but he was living at a time when humanism and Platonism were all kind of being brought into dialogue with scholasticism. And one of the questions that he was really interested in was about the material constitution of bodies, which is why we're all here today. So Cusanus, he affirms the existence of elements that act as the basic units of more complex bodies, but I think that his theological commitments, as we'll see, prevented him from embracing a super strict atomism. So through a synthesis of Platonic, Aristotelian, Neo-Pythagorean, and Neoplatonic thought, among others, through a synthesis of all of these sources, Cusanus argued that while any material being, even a so-called element, is further divisible in principle, nonetheless, the mathematical principles which we use to comprehend physical bodies will put limits on our analysis of the elements. So Cusanus's theology keeps him from conceiving of matter as either being composed of an actually infinite multitude of parts or of completely simple atoms, because for him, both infinity and unity can only be truly actualized in God. So he states somewhat cryptically that elements are analyzable into one another, but not infinitely so. Though metaphysically speaking, matter is always divisible, nonetheless, he thinks we can only carry our analysis of material things down for 4 levels. This is really odd. We'll talk about this more. So these two conclusions of Cusanus's seem to contradict, yet I think they actually exemplify a more general concept that informs his philosophy, which he calls learned ignorance. And this is for him, learned ignorance is the way that the human mind both acknowledges its cognitive limits, but also sort of by knowing one's own limitations, seeks a greater understanding of the created world. So his thought is admittedly a little bit abstruse. So we're going to try to work things out by first going through a brief historical sketch of his educational and philosophical influences. I'll then explore 2 of his own texts in detail, De Docta Ignorantia and De Conjecturis, which are both 2 fairly early texts in his corpus. And we'll see the ways in which these texts embrace and combine the different philosophical traditions that influence Cusanus's thought. And then we'll talk a little bit about how he was received and some takeaways we can draw. So I think it's a fascinating theory in its own right, and it's certainly worthy of further study. But Cusanus's account, I think, also illustrates the dialectic between the many philosophical systems, old, new, and newly rediscovered, that were available to thinkers in his time. So I'm looking forward to discussing it with you all. So Cusanus was born in 1401. He studied at Heidelberg, Padua, and Cologne. He studied a wide variety of disciplines. And specifically, we know that at the Studium Generale in Cologne, run by the Dominicans, the Neoplatonic texts, particularly of Proclus, were being taught at the time when Cusanus was there. So he was definitely exposed to those. Proclus and also Pseudo-Dionysius, although these were attributed to the actual Dionysius at the time. Then in addition to these texts and the Platonic dialogues that were re-entering the canon, Cusanus obviously was also educated in the scholastic theological tradition and also in canon law. And he also, so it's not clear or absolutely certain that he was reading the New Pythagorean text, the Theologumena Arithmeticae. This was a 4th century treatise that was attributed to Iamblichus, but we think that it was actually written or combined from the writings of Nicomachus and Iamblichus' teacher Anatolius. So we don't know whether Cusanus had direct access to this text, but there are several extant 14th and 15th century manuscripts. And he very clearly read and knew the work of Boethius, whose De Institutione Arithmetica draws many of its mathematical themes from the Neo-Pythagorean texts. And the parallels between these texts and Cusanus's own thought suggest that he was at least very familiar with these Neo-Pythagorean principles as well. And we see that he was very interested in sort of tracing the reception of certain natural philosophical principles through these different time periods. He talks about the view that proportion and number constitute the order of the cosmos, and he traces this from Pythagoras to Plato to Augustine to Boethius, mentions this very explicitly in his own writings, and how all of these thinkers sort of developed the Platonic tradition that the material world is intelligible through number, and sort of supplemented this with the biblical maxim that God has arranged all things by measure and number and weight. So he was very interested in sort of a Christian Platonic synthesis in his thought. And we also know that a lot of Italian students had gone abroad due to papal schism around this time being, the 14th century. And so they brought back the texts of a lot of the Oxford debates about atomism, infinity, and incommensurability. The Italian students who studied abroad brought these back to the continent and back to Padua specifically. So Cusanus almost certainly encountered these as well. So he had a lot of resources and scholarly traditions to draw upon. And his work synthesizes all of these, as we will see. So the first text that we're going to talk about of Cusanus's is De Docta Ignorantia. This text focuses, I think, mostly on the role of the elements in God's creation of the cosmos, and also treats more generally of what he calls learned ignorance. So he begins this treatise with a discussion of knowledge in general, and like a good Aristotelian, he says that knowledge should always proceed from something previously known. He also holds that all knowledge of finite beings must proceed by way of comparative relations between things. But he says, and this is our first text here, since comparative relation indicates an agreement in some one respect and at the same time indicates an otherness, it cannot be understood independently of number. Accordingly, number encompasses all things related comparatively. Therefore, number, which is a necessary condition of comparative relation, is present not only in quantity, but also in all things which in any manner whatsoever can agree or differ either substantially or accidentally. So he argues that if things weren't in some sense quantifiable, they would not be knowable. So here already we see the Pythagorean and Platonic traces in his epistemology. And yet, more often than not, he thinks we fail to completely grasp the numerical relations between things. So he says the precise combinations in corporeal things and the congruent relating of known to unknown surpass human reason to such an extent that Socrates seemed to himself to know nothing except that he did not know. So the more precisely we come to know the limits of our knowledge, says Cusanus, the wiser we will be, and the more we will attain to learned ignorance. In the case of God, who is infinite and thus cannot be compared to any finite thing, we best are able to come to know God when we comprehend, the limits of our ability to know him. And this is a theme that runs throughout Cusanus's entire corpus. One of his most famous ideas, which many of you are probably familiar with, that of the coincidentia oppositorum, or coincidence of opposites, actually sort of stems from this principle. At least this is how he develops it in this particular text. So Cusanus says that all finite, or he says contracted things, can be compared as greater or lesser to one another, but the infinite absolute maximum can't be comparable to these finite things and therefore is unknowable to us. But also, the maximum and the minimum are similarly incomparable. So there cannot be a greater thing than the maximum, and there cannot be a lesser thing in any meaningful way because there's no comparison. But the minimum is also that than which there cannot be a lesser. So he says the maximum and the minimum are both outside the scope of comparison. And if they cannot be compared or distinguished, surely they coincide. This is a very sort of vague, again, mystical almost principle of Cusanus's, but I think it's very important for understanding his cosmology in light of his view of God. So on these grounds, we can say that opposites coincide in God, but there's also a way in which God is beyond the coincidence of opposites, Cusa says, again, being very sort of seemingly contradictory, because God's being transcends the opposites or differences by which the human mind is able to comprehend finite beings. God is beyond all affirmation and negation, he says, and thus beyond the grasp of the human mind. But by meditating upon the coincidentia oppositorum, this is another way that the human mind can grow in the learned ignorance by which it comes to better know itself and thus better know God. So building on this characterization of God's infinity and unity and simplicity, Cusanus goes on to describe how finite beings are created by and also proceed from the divine being. And in doing so, he takes as a starting point the Anaxagorean maxim that each thing is in each thing. Cusanus says that everything which exists actually exists in God, who is pure actuality, and God exists in all things. But in contrast to God's infinitude, every created being is finite and contracted and cannot actually be all things, lest it be identical to God. So Cusanus cashes out Anaxagoras' claim by explaining that in each finite thing, all things are that thing. This is this really neat quote here. In an actually existing line, all figures are actually the line. And in an actually existing triangle, all figures are the triangle, and so on. In a stone, all things are stone. In a vegetative soul, vegetative soul. In life, life. In intellect, intellect. In God, God. So not unlike a Leibnizian monad almost, every finite being contains in itself the entire universe, but in a contracted manner such that all other beings are situated with respect to it. So Cusanus says the oneness of things, the unity of every being other than God, exists in plurality, and the plurality of things exists in oneness. And the elements which constitute all material bodies are no exception to this rule. So God created the universe using arithmetic geometry, music, and astronomy, says Cusanus, and the intermingling of the elements forms the foundation of this cosmic harmony. Moreover, he says, this is our quote here, God combined the elements with one another in such a relationship that necessarily the one element is present in the other. With regard to this combination, the earth is an animal, so to speak, according to Plato. So Cusanus sees order and especially, I think, teleology as fundamental to the existence of material creation. And the ability of the elements to be transformed into one another is crucial so that the cosmos can maintain its harmony as life and change occur throughout it. So to recap, the argument of this text, De Docta Ignorantia, begins from the apophatic methodology of learned ignorance to establish what we can know about God through the lens of the coincidentia oppositorum, and then goes on to understand all created beings in contrast to this conception of God. So every created thing is finite in contrast to God, who is infinite, and each thing achieves its unity not through divine simplicity, but from an ordered multiplicity by which it unfolds and stands in relation to every other finite being. And the most basic of these created things, which are the material elements, contain all other elements and can be analyzed into the others, a theme which Cusanus develops more in his later works. So let's take a look then at his next text, his next major text at least, De Conjecturis, where this comes to the fore even more clearly. So De Conjecturis was written sometime around 1441 to 1442, so a couple of years after the previous text. And so we've established already that true simplicity can be found only in God, in whom the minimum and maximum coincide. And so a simple element is actually kind of a contradiction in terms, because only God can be truly simple. And in De Conjecturis, Cusanus cashes this out in more detail, primarily using mathematical tools. So he says that the elements are reciprocally unitable to one another and analyzable into one another. So in other words, what it is to be fire is to be a combination of earth, water, and air. And similar accounts hold mutatis mutandis, of course, for the other three elements. And I think the key takeaway here is that metaphysically speaking, the elements are always further divisible due to their materiality and finitude, and thus lack of simplicity. But epistemologically, Cusanus is going to argue, we can only make sense of the elements through arithmetic and geometry. both of which constrain our analysis of the elements to 4 levels. And let's take a closer look at the text to see how these two conclusions hang together. So for Cusanus, all physical quantities differ from one another in degree, which means that you can always conceive of a greater or lesser body than any given one. This is our second text here. He says, some onenesses are more in a potential state of being united, whereas others are more in a state of actual unitedness. Thus, in the case of things that admit of more and less, we do not come to an unqualifiedly maximum or to an unqualifiedly minimum. We do not even arrive at determinate and perceptible elemental onenesses that are actually lowest and actually minimal. And this is so because, as we've discussed before, God is the only being that is both infinite and simple in actuality. And to think of an element as the terminus or the stopping point of analysis, we would have to presume that it was simple and therefore unable to differ in degree from other material bodies, which by Cusanus's metaphysics is impossible. So therefore, he says, this is our third text here, that which is composed of elements is not reducible into simple elements, since reduction cannot arrive at what is simple, and since a simple element lacks the power of existing actually. So as he noted in the previous text, De Doc Ignorantia, Cusanus is familiar with the Anaxagorean maxim that everything is everything, and he has a unique metaphysical manner of parsing this phrase, but he does not believe that any elemental body actually contains an infinite number of parts. So instead, he holds that the procession of oneness into otherness must stop after 4 levels, at least in our human understanding. And he gives a twofold argument for this fourfold structure. So first, in an arithmetic and Pythagorean vein, he explains that since 4 is the number that enfolds and contains all numbers, then the most perfect unity that a created being can achieve is a unity that comes from a 4-fold ordered multiplicity. And then second, from a more geometric and Platonic perspective, he shows that in our understanding of physical bodies, which we achieve through analogy to geometry, we can only carry our analysis down through 4 steps. Just like in geometry, there's only sort of the 4 levels of a solid, a surface, a line, and a point. And like a point, concludes Cusanus, a simple element is more a conceptual terminus than a unified subsisting thing. So he really wants to develop an arithmetic argument for this point because he sees number as fundamental to human knowing, as we've talked about before. So number, he says here, is nothing other than reason unfolded. For number is proved to be the beginning of those things that are attained by reason, proved to such an extent that if number is removed, then reason shows that none of those things attained by reason would remain. Moreover, reason's unfolding of number and its using number to make surmises is nothing other than reason's using itself and mentally fashioning all surmised things in a natural supreme likeness of itself, just as in and through his co-eternal word, God, who is infinite mind, communicates being to things. So this isn't to say that number is a purely human construction or that it doesn't at all reflect the reality of things. But instead, I think number is the way by which the human mind imitates and comes to know the divine mind, whose word is the exemplar of all creation. So this numerical structure by which we know the world also reflects creation's progression from and return to its first principle. And Cusanus gives us this really neat diagram here. The number 4 plays an important role in modeling this procession and return. And this is because in a Neo-Pythagorean fashion, Cusanus says that the number 4 in some way contains every other number. And this is really straight out of the Theologum and Arithmeticae. So Cusanus says, number's progression is completed in the number 4. For 1, 2, 3, and 4 added together will make 10, which unfolds the numerical power of simple oneness. And this process repeats for each higher power of 10. So for example, 10, 20, 30, and 40 together make 100, the square of 10. And this 4-step progression of distinct yet ordered onenesses instantiates universal oneness in a manifold way, says Cusanus. So created beings can achieve a particular kind of unity if they are ordered in such a way. So he then applies this arithmetical principle to the case of the elements with the help of another fun diagram. So Cusanus says that each of the 4 elements contains the other 3. Each of those 3 components contain the other 3 within itself. And then again, each of those components contains the 3 others. And at this point, the analysis ends. So in his own words, he says, take a look at this diagram. And if you imagine the entire largest circle to be fire or air or water or earth, you will see how it is that in it are contained the circles of the other 3 elements, and also how it is that in the air that is enfolded in the fire, the other 3 elements are present, and so on. But this process does not continue beyond 4 times. Therefore, there is advancement from the universal unto the specific by means of a 4-fold progression. So through this progression, every element achieves the most perfect unity possible for a finite, material, and divisible being. That's the unity of what Cusa says is a 4-fold descent of oneness and a 4-fold return on the part of otherness. So there we see the very Platonic, Neoplatonic sort of exitus, reditus language as well. And Cusa says it's not an accident that this 4-fold structure is also present in geometry, which following the tradition since the Timaeus and its likely story, geometry is the primary analogy through which we understand the elements. So like Plato, Cusanus singles out the triangle as the building block of all solid figures. And then he explains the composition of the individual elements, as well as their transmutation into one another in geometric terms. So just as points define lines, lines define surfaces, and surfaces define solids, so too we can conceive of any 3 elements as composing the 4th, and then that element in turn being able to compose a larger body. And in addition, every geometric body can be reduced to tetrahedra and thus can be defined by 4 points. And analogously, every physical body is ultimately reducible to and can be defined by the 4 elements. So if we use this image to understand the way that the elements are present in one another, we see that we can't conceive of an actually infinite number of what he calls enfoldings or levels of compositions. So we can understand composition in principle through our knowledge of the 4-fold composition of geometric solids, but there's nothing in our comprehension by which we could know an actual infinite, he thinks. So as Euclidean geometry has a limited number of dimensions, because a point has no parts that can be further divided, and combining 2 polyhedra won't give you a new object of a higher dimension, you just get a bigger polyhedron. So too, Cusa says there are natural limits on the analysis that we can make of the elements. And he says there's even a way in which the way that this analogy fails teaches us something, because he says that attempting to carry our analysis of the elements further would kind of be like trying to distinguish each and every point that can be picked out on a line. And he says no finite multitude of points, not 4, not 40, not 4 million, like no finite multitude will ever exhaustively enumerate all the points on a line. And so too, we know through learned ignorance that mathematics can take us a very long way in our understanding of the natural world. But nonetheless, every material being will always be further divisible. This is at least metaphysically. And to that extent, these material beings are going to, in part, elude our mathematical grasp of them. So to sum up, Cusanus argues in De Conjecturis that even at the most fundamental level of material being, we can't find true simplicity or total intelligibility because these only belong to God. So we can imitate God's knowledge to a limited extent through mathematical analyses of the physical world, but we have to bear in mind that we can never achieve absolute precision in these analyses. And even the most useful models can never perfectly capture the realities themselves. But we can say something meaningful about the cosmos, and Cusanus demonstrates this by, I think, very masterfully weaving together pieces from the many thinkers with which he was familiar. So he combines the Anaxagorean principle of everything and everything, the Pythagorean principle that the number 4 contains every other number, the Platonic model of the elements as geometric solids, the Aristotelian principle, matter's infinite divisibility, and also the Neoplatonic notion of creation's procession into multiplicity and its return to its unified source, to name just a few of his many influences. So it's very complex and at times unwieldy, but I think that Cusanus's doctrine itself actually exhibits the philosophical principle that every unity besides God is a synthesis of multiplicity. So then what do we make of Cusanus's work in the broader context of late medieval theories of matter? So he's often thought of as a forerunner of Renaissance and early modern thought, but he does maintain certain fundamental Aristotelian views, specifically on like potency and matter and substance. He can perhaps be called an atomist in a practical sense because he thinks we can't actually divide matter forever, but he maintains matter's infinite divisibility from a metaphysical standpoint. And so I've shown you here a text that, taken out of context, can be used to argue that he is an atomist, where he says, with respect to the mind's consideration, a continuum is divided into what is further and further divisible, and the multitude increases ad infinitum. However, in actually dividing, we come to a part that is actually indivisible. This part I call an atom, for an atom is a quantity that, because of its smallness, is actually indivisible. So too, with respect to the mind's consideration, multitude has no end, yet it actually comes to an end. And this is from a text of his, Idiota de Mente, the layman on the mind, which is written in the late 1440s. So here, Cusanus affirms propositions which, as usual, seem to be contradictory. It seems like he's saying there are atoms in a practical sense, even if metaphysically material ought to be further divisible. So maybe some people would say he does so out of a very stubborn Aristotelian dogmatism, even if he's tempted by atomism, or maybe he's just paying lip service to scholasticism out of an abundance of caution. And later Renaissance atomists, such as Giordano Bruno, who is very greatly influenced by Cusanus, may have thought so. And Paolo Rossini has a lot of good work on this. But Cusanus's hesitancy to admit the actuality of truly simple atoms or the actuality of an infinite multitude thereof, I think, is motivated less by dogmatism and more by his core theological commitments, namely his commitments to God as the only purely actual and simple being, and to creation as always finite and disunified in comparison to God, and also to the limitations of the human mind and its knowledge of the physical world. So Cusanus sees no issue with acknowledging both that God created the world in order and harmony, and that our own mathematical concepts are unable to fully know that world, because he wants to make a distinction between the number created by the divine mind and the number created by the finite mind. And our number, he says, is the image of divine number. So then, of course, the mathematical concepts of our mind are going to fall short of those of the divine mind. But here again, the person of learned ignorance knows that they could never fully comprehend the structure of the universe as it exists in the intellect of God. So it's fitting then that Cusanus closes the second book of his De Docta Ignorantia with a doxological meditation on the cosmos, which I have for you here. He says, "Who would not admire this artisan who, with regard to the spheres, the stars, and the regions of the stars, used such skill that there is both a harmony of all things and a diversity of all things? With regard to these objects, which are so worthy of admiration, so varied and so different, we recognize through learned ignorance that we cannot know the rationale for any of God's works, but can only marvel, for the Lord is great, whose greatness is without end." So in the elements of the cosmos, whose unity consists in the enfolding of multiplicity, Cusanus sees both the descent of the cosmos into matter and its return towards the one that is its source. But to the extent that he, I think, very humbly but earnestly seeks to understand that cosmos, his mind, too, I think, becomes an image of the mind of the divine artisan. So thank you all for listening, and thank you to the conference organizers for all of their hard work, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.